A U.S. judge secretly blocked whistleblower reports about illegal government surveillance until Jasmine Crockett exposed her with a memo signed by the judge herself. What happened next shook the courtroom, and 27 million Americans watched it unfold. How did one woman force the truth into the light, risking her career to do it? And what exactly was in the folder that made the judge go silent? This is a story worth every second of your time. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was early Monday morning in Washington, D.C., but inside the heavily fortified Congressional Oversight Building, the air already felt heavier than usual. The hearing was scheduled as routine, a closed-door session on alleged abuses within domestic surveillance programs. Most expected a quiet shuffle of legal jargon and redacted testimony. Then Jasmine Crockett walked in, a black attorney with a reputation for making liars squirm and institutions sweat. She didn't come to perform. She came to confront. Dressed in a sharp slate suit, eyes like fire behind calm glass, she didn't carry a briefcase. She carried a box, battered, taped shut, and heavier than it looked. Not with weight, with truth. Heads turned slowly. Whispers stopped. Jasmine didn't pause, didn't nod, didn't blink. She moved like someone who'd been dragged through the mud by the very system now asking her to testify, only to rise, unbroken. She was expected to submit, to soften her edge, maybe to crumble under the panel's pressure, but they didn't know her story. They didn't know the box she brought held documents they buried, names they erased, and signatures they thought would never surface. As she sat and placed the box on the table with a soft, echoing thud, the atmosphere shifted. This wasn't going to be another hearing. It was about to become a confrontation with everything they tried to hide. And seated at the helm of it all, gavel in hand, eyes like steel, was the one person Jasmine Crockett had never trusted to play fair. Judge Evelyn Hartley was a legend in D.C., not for fairness, but for control. Sharp-tongued, stone-faced, and utterly immovable, she ran her courtroom like a battlefield where only she held the map. Her record was pristine on paper, but beneath it lay years of buried complaints, sealed files, and rulings that always seemed to favor power over people. She didn't tolerate disruptions, especially not from voices like Jasmine's, young, black, unafraid. To Hartley, this wasn't a hearing, it was a test of obedience. She expected Jasmine to fold, to explain herself, to play by rules written in invisible ink. But what she didn't expect was for Jasmine to arrive ready to put her on the record instead. So when Judge Hartley finally leaned forward, her voice cold and calculated, the room braced, not for a question, but for the trap everyone knew was coming. "Ms. Crockett," Judge Hartley said, slow and deliberate, "this panel requires you to disclose the identity of the individual who provided you with the classified information regarding unauthorized surveillance programs." Her words echoed through the chamber like a loaded gun being cocked. The tone wasn't inquisitive. It was a demand dressed as due process. Jasmine sat still, her back straight, eyes locked forward, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from fear, but from knowing exactly what kind of fight you've walked into. Around her, aides glanced up from their notes. A junior congressman cleared his throat and then thought better of speaking. Even the cameras, previously indifferent, now zoomed in just a little closer. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't even look at the judge right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable. Then calmly, she turned her head and said, "Let me understand this, Your Honor." Her voice level but unmistakably cutting. "You're asking me to expose someone who risked everything to reveal a crime, just to satisfy the very person who helped cover it up?" The air tightened. One of the panelists shifted in their seat. Another scribbled something they'd never expected to write. Jasmine kept going, voice unwavering. "You want me to light the match that burns the whistleblower alive, when the person who lit the fire in the first place is sitting on that bench?" Her eyes never left Hartley's. It wasn't defiance for show. It was a mirror being held up to power, and power didn't like what it saw. Judge Hartley's jaw tensed, but she didn't interrupt. She couldn't, because in that moment everyone in the room understood exactly what Jasmine had just done. She hadn't refused the question. She had turned it inside out. She had made it clear that the real threat to justice wasn't the source, but the system demanding that source be sacrificed. And for the first time that morning, the balance of power began to shift, quietly, relentlessly, irreversibly. But Jasmine didn't come to play defense. She came to bring receipts, and now it was time to show the first one. She reached down without a word, her movements deliberate, quiet, and controlled. The box sat at her feet like a loaded weapon, plain, brown, and unremarkable on the outside. But inside it held something far more explosive than any headline. With a soft click, she undid the latches and slowly lifted the lid. The cardboard creaked in the silence, and the whole room leaned forward, not physically but mentally, instinctively. Everyone could feel it. Something was about to change. Jasmine didn't fumble. Her hand slipped inside and emerged with a single sheet, protected by a transparent sleeve, held between two fingers like a scalpel. She raised it to eye level, letting the overhead lights hit the top of the page, where a thick, unmistakable stamp burned across the margin. Declassified. 7:42 a.m. this morning. The red ink glowed like a warning flare, and then, lower down the page in bold black print, neat, official, irrefutable, was a signature that made the room freeze. Evelyn M. Hartley. Jasmine turned the document outward, facing the panel, making sure the cameras had a clean shot. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Let's stop pretending," she said calmly. "You wanted to know where this information came from. It came from a memo, signed by the judge presiding over this hearing." Gasps didn't come loudly. They came in sharp intakes of breath, side glances, pens dropped quietly onto legal pads. The silence that followed wasn't disbelief, it was recognition. Everyone in that room knew what they were looking at. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a confession hiding in plain sight. But the signature was only the beginning. What the document said was far more damning than whose name was on it. The room watched as Jasmine laid the memo flat on the table, pressing it gently with both hands like she was anchoring something dangerous from blowing the lid off the hearing. Her voice was calm but unflinching. "This document confirms that, in the weeks leading up to the midterm elections, Judge Evelyn Hartley issued a directive to delay the transfer of whistleblower complaints to the proper congressional oversight channels." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Not for legal review, not for national security, but for optics." The panelists stared frozen. Jasmine continued, flipping the page slightly to expose the next line, highlighted and unmistakable. "Recommend postponement to avoid risk of institutional narrative conflict during electoral cycle." The phrase sounded clinical, even harmless, but everyone in that room knew exactly what it meant. It meant truth was treated like a liability. It meant someone in power had chosen to shield political convenience over constitutional accountability, and that someone was sitting 10 feet away, silent. Jasmine looked directly at Judge Hartley now, voice unwavering. "You didn't suppress these reports because they lack credibility. You suppressed them because their timing made the truth inconvenient." Her words weren't angry. They were surgical. Hartley, once known for controlling every word in her courtroom, didn't interrupt, didn't shift, didn't blink. Her silence wasn't poise, it was paralysis. This was a woman who had dominated courtrooms for decades, who had cut down attorneys with a single raised eyebrow. But now, seated above the truth she once buried, she had nothing to say. The chamber didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The stillness said everything. No one shuffled their papers. No one reached for their coffee. The hearing had shifted into something else entirely, not a procedure, but a reckoning. And at the center of it stood Jasmine Crockett, holding not just a piece of paper, but proof that power had chosen silence over justice. Until now. But Jasmine wasn't finished, because behind every buried memo, there's always a trail, and this time, it led straight to Judge Hartley's inbox. Jasmine reached into the box again, slower this time, as if choosing the next piece of evidence required precision, not just for impact, but for truth. She pulled out a printed set of emails, government format, official headers, date stamps clear and bold. Her fingers pinched the corner of the top page as she raised it toward the panel. "This," she said, voice steady and low, "is an internal communication from the Office of Legal Counsel addressed directly to Judge Hartley's chambers. She handed copies to the clerk, who moved faster now, the room no longer relaxed but alert. The contents are not redacted. The language is not vague. It reads, advise holding transmission of surveillance-related data to congressional committees until political conditions stabilize. Jasmine paused, letting the words settle like dust before a storm. She looked up again, eyes hard. This wasn't bureaucracy. This wasn't legal review. This was coordination, designed to keep the people's representatives in the dark. The weight in the room deepened. Jasmine flipped to the second page, tapping a highlighted line. Risk of premature exposure ahead of midterm cycle identified as unacceptable. No one spoke. No one moved. This wasn't theory. It was proof. Judge Hartley hadn't just signed off on a delay. She had helped craft a message that made concealment sound procedural. Jasmine placed the email printouts on the desk like a final puzzle piece. This came from her office, and she said, not loud but undeniable. It didn't pass through her hands. It originated there. And in that moment, there was no space left to hide behind protocol. Only silence, and paper, and truth in plain black ink. But paper wasn't the only thing Jasmine brought. Some truths aren't just written, they're spoken, and this one was caught on tape. Jasmine reached into the box one last time, her movements slower now, deliberate, as if the final piece she was about to reveal deserved its own kind of silence. From a padded sleeve, she pulled out a small digital recorder, placed it carefully on the table, and looked directly at the panel. This recording, she said clearly, was obtained through protected legal channels. It captures a closed-door meeting between senior staff in the judiciary, discussing how to stall legal oversight requests. Her thumb hovered over the play button for a breath. Then she pressed it. The sound that followed was crisp. No distortion, no ambiguity. A male voice came through first. If we hold the transfer until after midterms, it softens the blow. Congress will move on. Then another, more cautious voice replied, we need Hartley to sign off on this. No movement unless she backs it. And finally, the one that made the entire room stiffen. We're not protecting institutions here. We're protecting the party. Let's not kid ourselves. Jasmine didn't react. She let the tape roll for its full 27 seconds. Then silence. The kind that hums in your ears. The kind that makes a courtroom feel like a locked vault with no exit. She looked around once slowly, then turned her eyes back to the bench. That recording wasn't vague. It wasn't out of context. And it wasn't hypothetical. Her voice didn't rise, but it sharpened with every word. It was clear, it was strategic, and it pointed directly to this bench. She tapped the recorder once with her finger. You asked me to name the source behind the revelations that brought us here today. Then she paused, long enough for every camera in the room to lock in. So I will. She gestured first to the memo, then to the email, and finally to the playback device still glowing red. The person who delayed justice, the person who tried to bury the warnings, the person who now demands I betray those who step forward. Her eyes locked with Hartley's. That person is you, Your Honor. And after the final piece landed, voice, memo, email, the weight of truth became too heavy for even the judge's silence to carry. For a long moment, no one in the room moved. Judge Evelyn Hartley, the woman who had commanded courtrooms with an iron tone and impenetrable stare, now sat frozen in place, rigid, stone-faced, but clearly unraveling beneath the surface. Her lips parted once, as if to speak, but no words came. Because what could she possibly say? Every line she might use to regain control had already been stripped bare by the evidence laid before her. Her gavel rested untouched. Her authority, once unquestioned, had dissolved into something thinner than the silence that now gripped the chamber. It wasn't that Jasmine Crockett had spoken louder. It was that her truth had been heavier, and it landed like a fist on marble. The panelists, once neutral, even skeptical, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One senator, who had entered the chamber with visible disinterest, leaned in toward the clerk and whispered something with urgency. Another, who had nodded politely during Hartley's opening remarks, now glanced at the exposed memo with a stunned kind of stillness. This wasn't a procedural hearing anymore. It had become something else. something dangerous, something historical. Reporters, previously waiting for a statement or a walkout quote, now scribbled frantically, eyes flicking from the documents to Hartley to Jasmine, as if trying to confirm this moment was actually happening. The balance had tilted, and no one knew if it would ever return. Cameras, which had remained still throughout most of the morning, now inched closer, not for drama, but for documentation. A quiet murmur moved across the press section as producers and correspondents realized the implications. A sitting federal judge, caught in her own paper trail, unable to offer a defense, and not by chance, not by mistake, but by design. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It was a slow, deliberate dismantling of deceit. Jasmine hadn't flailed. She hadn't ranted. She had brought truth like a scalpel and made every slice count. She didn't need a headline. She had just rewritten the story. Judge Hartley blinked, finally, but still said nothing. Her eyes, once sharp with calculated distance, now looked blurred. Somewhere between shock and disbelief, as if her mind was racing to find an escape hatch that no longer existed. Her silence wasn't the silence of control. It was the silence of collapse. The only sound in the room was the hum of the audio recorder still on the desk, its red light blinking like a heartbeat in a chamber that had none. Then slowly, Jasmine rose from her seat. She didn't rush, didn't glare, didn't gesture. She simply stood with the composure of someone who had walked through fire and come out holding the matchbook. Her voice when she spoke was low, not whispered, but quiet enough to make the room lean in to hear. "Justice doesn't need a stage," she said. "It just needs enough space to speak." She picked up the memo, then the email, then the recorder, handling each as if they were sacred pieces of a broken truth finally put back together. Her eyes moved to each panelist in turn, not demanding, not pleading, just letting them see her. Letting them feel what it meant to be a witness in a system that expected her to be a target. "For years," she continued, "this institution demanded obedience in the name of process, loyalty in the name of order, silence in the name of stability. But none of those things are justice. They're just excuses." Somewhere in the room, a reporter lowered her pen, too stunned to keep writing. A younger aide at the back whispered to his colleague, "This just flipped everything." And he was right, because in the span of 20 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had done something few ever imagined possible. She had put the system itself on trial and won. She walked to the center of the chamber now, not behind the desk, not above it, but within it. Not as a subordinate, not even as a challenger, but as a mirror. And the system didn't like what it saw in her reflection. "This court," she said, now turning back to Judge Hartley, "asked me for the name of my source." She took a breath. Her voice didn't tremble. It anchored. But sometimes the most dangerous secret isn't the source of the truth. It's the one trying hardest to bury it. She placed each document gently on the main evidence table. No theatrics, no final slam, just fact, just light, just silence. Then she looked straight ahead and spoke the final words that would echo beyond that room, into headlines, history books, and hearts. Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs someone brave enough to hold the light steady while it speaks through the dark. And that was it. No applause, no gavel, no objection. Just silence. The kind that follows a reckoning. The kind that leaves the guilty staring down at their own signatures and wondering how long they believed no one would ever read them aloud. Outside the hearing room, the tone had already changed. Journalists were live streaming not summaries but turning points. Editorial boards were already calling emergency meetings. Congressional aides were drafting memos, real ones this time, calling for an independent review into judicial misconduct. The courtroom wasn't just stunned, it was shifting. The questions had changed, and now the court itself was the one being questioned. As Jasmine gathered her papers and turned to leave, she didn't look back. She didn't have to. Her job was done, not in the sense of victory, but in the deeper sense of witness. She hadn't just testified to what she knew. She had reminded the nation of what it had forgotten, that silence in the face of injustice isn't neutrality, it's complicity. But what happened inside that courtroom didn't stay behind those walls. Truth, once released, has a way of echoing far louder than the voices that tried to silence it. By nightfall, the country had seen it, not in fragments, not in filtered sound bites, but in full. The video of Jasmine Crockett's testimony wasn't just shared, it detonated. At first, it spread in waves. Legal bloggers, civil rights forums, a few Twitter accounts known for tracking government transparency. Then it hit cable news. Then it hit primetime. By 8 p.m., the full video was being played on a loop across the three biggest networks, unedited, uninterrupted. Her voice echoed from screens across airports, bars, hospital lobbies, and kitchens. Her words, measured, calm, sharpened by truth, cut through the static of daily noise like a blade. The line was everywhere. Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs someone brave enough to hold the light steady while it speaks through the dark. That sentence wasn't just repeated. It was printed on headlines, burned into protest signs, carved into conversations on podcasts, live streams, news roundtables, and courtroom blogs. For some, it was validation. For others, it was a threat. But no one could look away, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just spoken truth to power. She had done it in a room full of it, and left without flinching. By midnight, editorial boards from coast to coast had pulled emergency meetings. The New York Times ran the headline, "One woman, one folder, a whole system shaken." The Washington Post's lead read, "When a witness becomes the judge." But this wasn't just about sound bites or politics. This was about something far older, something deeper. For millions of Americans watching, the hearing didn't just reveal one judge's corruption, it revealed something they had long suspected but never heard confirmed out loud. That the system had rules for them, and no rules for those in robes. That behind every redaction was a decision, and behind every decision was a hand. And sometimes that hand was hiding more than the truth. The questions came fast and loud. On morning radio, commuters debated, if a federal judge can suppress whistleblowers, what else are they suppressing? In veteran groups, barbershops, union halls, since when did justice become selective? College campuses lit up with forums titled Power, Transparency, and the Public Right to Know. High school civics teachers paused their regular curriculum to dissect the hearing line by line. And through it all, Jasmine's voice remained steady, not because she was everywhere, but because the footage was. She wasn't making press appearances. She wasn't campaigning. She didn't need to. She had already said everything that needed to be said, on the record, under oath, with the system watching. Meanwhile, the ripple effect inside Washington was seismic. Congressional aides scrambled to draft oversight letters. Judiciary subcommittees convened closed-door sessions of their own. Some judges quietly deactivated social media accounts. Others issued press statements condemning political theater. But no one believed them. Not after hearing that recording, not after reading that memo, not after watching a judge go completely silent while the evidence bearing her own name sat glowing under courtroom lights. The Department of Justice, under mounting public pressure, announced an internal review. Not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Civil liberties organizations filed open records requests by the hour. FOIA portals crashed twice from volume. Whistleblower protection groups saw a record surge in inquiries. Even international watchdogs began asking questions. But while institutions scrambled to save face, something far more important was happening out in the open. A conversation had been reborn, one not driven by outrage but by clarity. What is the purpose of public office? Who gets to define national security? When does secrecy protect people? And when does it only protect power? These weren't academic questions anymore. They were dinner table questions, subway ride questions, Sunday morning coffee questions. And at the center of all of them stood Jasmine Crockett. Not as a politician, not as a pundit, but as a symbol of what happens when someone walks into the lion's den carrying nothing but facts. Yet through all the noise, few forgot the weight she carried into that hearing. Because for every headline she sparked, there was the unspoken burden she bore. The risk of being disbarred, the risk of being smeared, the risk of being dismissed, patronized, or worse, ignored. She stood alone that morning, no backing committee, no press team, Just a plain suit, a box of documents, and the unshakable conviction that the truth had waited long enough. And perhaps that's why it struck so deeply. Not because she was loud, but because she was right. She hadn't called for a revolution. She hadn't asked for applause. She had simply walked into a system that expected her to stay quiet, and she refused. That refusal echoed in the way the public responded. It wasn't just admiration, it was recognition. Recognition that justice wasn't supposed to be a performance. Recognition that transparency shouldn't come only after damage control. Recognition that when someone stands in front of the machine and says, "You don't scare me," the rest of us are reminded that we still have power too. In a country where trust in institutions had long been fractured, Jasmine didn't fix it. She didn't promise to. What she did was rarer. She made it clear that trust must be earned, not demanded. And once broken, it can't be patched with silence. The fallout was far from over. Hearings were reopened, subpoenas were issued. The court that once judged her now found itself under investigation. But Jasmine Crockett? She didn't gloat. She didn't claim victory. She stayed quiet. Because the truth had already spoken, and the country was still listening. The sound of Jasmine's footsteps leaving that courtroom hadn't even faded before the system she had just exposed began to shake from within. Judge Evelyn Hartley, once revered and feared across federal circles, was placed on immediate administrative leave. The order came not from a whisper campaign or political pressure, but from a unanimous motion inside the Judicial Conduct Oversight Committee. It wasn't just because of Jasmine Crockett's testimony. It was because of the evidence, the signatures, the emails, the recordings. It was because the paper trail had stopped being metaphor and became law. And now Hartley wasn't overseeing hearings. She was the subject of one. The federal investigation launched with surgical speed. Justice Department inspectors, accompanied by congressional staffers, arrived at Hartley's chambers by sunrise the next day. Files that had been marked sealed were unsealed. Emails thought deleted were recovered. Internal communications marked "do not circulate" were now under review by auditors, analysts, and legal scholars. The press called it unprecedented. Investigators called it overdue. And yet, even in the wake of that reckoning, the weight of injustice still lingered, especially for those who had nearly been destroyed by it. Two whistleblowers, names previously scrubbed from public record, careers nearly shattered, families pushed into hiding, were contacted directly by the Office of Legal Counsel. Not to be threatened this time, not to be silenced, but to be cleared. Their testimonies, once labeled inflammatory and in conflict with institutional interest, were officially reinstated into the case logs. Their warnings had been valid all along. Their concerns hadn't been disruptive. They'd been right. Federal protection orders were issued on their behalf. Charges previously threatened against them were dropped and erased. And for the first time in nearly 3 years, both individuals could walk into their workplaces, not as suspects, but as patriots. The public reaction didn't waver. If anything, it intensified. Legal panels across networks held emergency episodes. Podcast hosts shifted entire season schedules to cover the fallout. Law professors changed mid-semester curriculums to make room for the hearing transcript. One clip, Jasmine pointing to the bench and saying, "You asked for my source. The name is yours," was replayed more than 20 million times within the first 2 days. But the analysis went deeper than applause. It wasn't just about Hartley. It wasn't just about Jasmine. It was about what happens when a system built on secrecy finally collides with someone who has nothing left to lose, but everything to defend. Public ethics forums erupted with debate. Was the judiciary still accountable to the people? How many other truths had been buried in the name of procedural discretion? Were whistleblowers truly protected or simply tolerated until inconvenient? In one televised town hall, a moderator turned directly to the audience and asked, "When did we decide truth should wait until it's convenient?" The room fell silent. That silence spoke louder than any answer. Meanwhile, students in law schools from Harvard to Howard studied the Crockett-Hartley confrontation, not as a trial, but as a case study in reversal. A moment where the rules of power didn't just bend, they broke. In lectures, professors paused to highlight one specific tactic Jasmine had used. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She didn't dramatize. She documented. She built a wall of truth so high and so solid, not even authority could climb over it. One evening, a nationally syndicated anchor, known for his scathing wit and aversion to sentiment, looked directly into the camera and said the line that would be repeated everywhere for weeks to come. "We just watched a woman flip a courtroom by making it put itself on trial." And that's exactly what it had been. A courtroom built for cross-examination had become the defendant's box. The judge's seat had become a spotlight. And Jasmine Crockett, armed only with declassified documents, one audio file, and an unshakable moral spine, had become the one holding the gavel. But none of it had come without a cost. Jasmine had faced pressure no one in the room could see. In the days leading up to her testimony, she'd received warnings, both subtle and not. Former colleagues told her to be careful. Political insiders reminded her of long-term reputational damage. Even allies hinted she should pick her battles. But she hadn't picked a battle. She'd answered a call. And now in the aftermath, her answer had become a national mirror. The system hadn't fallen, but it had been seen, clearly, publicly, and without excuse, and it couldn't unsee itself. The Federal Bar Association issued a rare statement applauding the integrity of public testimony in the face of institutional obstruction. The American Whistleblower Protection Coalition held its largest conference turnout in history, headlined by a panel titled, "Silence is Not Neutrality: Lessons from the Crockett Hearing." Even a few previously reluctant lawmakers, those known more for calculated statements than bold positions, found themselves cornered by public demand. They didn't just call for policy change. They called for oversight of the very people who had once been above questioning. But Jasmine said nothing. She didn't tour networks. She didn't accept interviews. She returned to her work. When asked why she didn't appear on talk shows or write op-eds, her spokesperson gave a simple answer. She already said what she needed to. On the record, under oath. That's where it matters. And perhaps that, more than anything, is why the moment endured. Because she hadn't done it for spectacle. She hadn't done it for legacy. She had done it because justice should not be seasonal, conditional, or optional. And now it wasn't. In committee halls, judges' chambers, university debate forums, in Sunday sermons, the name Jasmine Crockett became more than a headline. It became a signal, a reminder, that truth doesn't care about your title. It doesn't wait for your timing. And it doesn't lose power just because it makes powerful people uncomfortable. In the weeks that followed, a full inquiry into federal judicial oversight was launched. Subpoenas were issued, transparency mandates were passed. But even as the institutional gears began turning, the people, those watching, reading, learning, had already turned their eyes towards something far more important than headlines: accountability. And for once, they weren't asking it from the powerless. They were demanding it from the ones who claimed to speak in their name. That was the real shift, the real fallout. Because when a single courtroom moment cracks open a system, what pours out isn't just consequence, it's clarity. And Jasmine Crockett had delivered it without rage, without theater, without compromise. Just light, held steady, long enough for the country to finally see what had always been there. And yet, even as her name dominated headlines, hashtags, and hearings, Jasmine Crockett disappeared. Because some people don't chase the spotlight. They walk away from it to make room for something greater. The offers came fast. National networks, streaming giants, exclusive interviews, full-length profiles, podcast specials with bonus segments, and commercial-free tributes. Producers fought over airtime slots. Publicists scrambled to outbid each other for the chance to package her story. She was called the face of truth, a modern-day guardian of justice, the woman who made the bench answer for its sins. They offered cameras, columns, even book deals, 7 figures for 7 days of storytelling. But Jasmine Crockett didn't say no to the spotlight. She ignored it. While studio lights waited, she slipped out the back. While panels dissected her composure and viral clips racked up millions of views, she was already on a train. No press, no entourage, no escort. Headed back to the same city block where she first learned what justice felt like when it wasn't fair. Her phone rang for days. She let it. Emails flooded in. She archived them. PR agents pitched her memoir titles before she'd even unpacked her case files. But Jasmine had already chosen the one thing they couldn't offer her: peace without performance. Because this had never been about her. She didn't fight that courtroom war to be remembered. She fought it because no one else would. And now that it was over, at least publicly, she didn't want applause. She wanted work, real work, quiet, necessary, unfinished work. She returned to her small office on the south side of town. The sign outside hadn't changed in years. Crockett Legal Aid, Civil Rights, Tenant Defense, Community Law. The lights flickered when she walked in. Her inbox overflowed with housing disputes, unpaid wage cases, and immigration hearings. And she sat down, no fanfare, no statement, and got back to it, as if the world hadn't watched her dismantle a system on national television just days earlier. Inside that office, justice didn't wear robes. It came in the form of eviction notices, deportation threats, and fathers trying to see their children. It didn't care about hashtags or viral clips. It cared about rent due by Friday, about broken probation promises, about the small, constant grind of people getting steamrolled by power too far above them to see. Jasmine took her seat like she always had. Her desk, worn smooth from years of pro bono briefs, welcomed her back without ceremony. Her paralegal, who'd watched the hearing from a cracked phone screen, looked at her and said, "Are you sure you should be here?" Jasmine smiled, only slightly. "I was never supposed to be anywhere else," she replied. But that didn't mean she hadn't paid for her choices. In the days after the hearing, the backlash came in cold waves. Thinly veiled threats, anonymous messages about knowing where she lived, subtle warnings that her bar license could come under review, op-eds accusing her of grandstanding, of weaponizing optics, of undermining judicial independence. But she took it all the same way she took every case file that landed on her desk. She opened it, read it, and refused to flinch. Because Jasmine knew something most people in power forget. Spotlights burn out. Cameras move on. But the system, the one that nearly buried those whistleblowers, the one that told her to stay quiet, to stay in her lane, to not challenge the hand that holds the gavel, that system doesn't reform from interviews. It reforms when someone walks back into the dark corners and keeps doing the work without needing anyone to watch. She met with clients face to face, sat across from single mothers too afraid to ask for help, showed up to city zoning meetings with folders full of evidence, filed motions no one would ever tweet about. And when someone brought up the hearing, she would only say that was accountability. This, she gestured to the stack of unresolved legal aid forms, this is justice. The injustice she faced never fully left her. She carried it like weight stitched into her spine. Being a black woman in a courtroom designed to crush dissent meant she was always 10 seconds from being dismissed, misquoted, or discredited. But she turned that pressure into presence, into control, into something unshakable. Even the walls of her office seemed to remember it now. No gold plaques, no framed headlines, just one photo on her desk, her first client, hugging her after a landlord tried to illegally evict 3 generations of her family. That moment mattered more than a million retweets. And still, the spotlight searched for her. Producers reached out again, this time softer, more carefully worded. "We don't want to exploit it," they said. "We just want to honor what you did." Jasmine never responded. Her silence was louder than any interview, because the people who needed her already knew where to find her. In waiting rooms, in courthouses, in community centers, in the places where justice still showed up late, or not at all. And maybe, just maybe, that's what shook the system the most. Not that she fought back, not that she won, but that, when it was over, she walked away from the empire they tried to hand her and chose the street corner where justice still needs defending. No press conference, no farewell speech, just a closed door, a flickering light, and a woman behind a desk, head down, voice calm, fighting her next battle like no one was watching. Because the truth? She never needed them to watch. She only needed them to listen. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't just come back to work. She came back to build something no courtroom could ever tear down again. In the weeks after the dust settled, Jasmine did what no one expected her to do. She stopped reacting to the headlines and started designing a solution. Quietly, with no press release or podium, she registered a nonprofit from her legal office. The name was simple: the Shield Project. No slogans, no marketing team, just a mission etched into every document it processed: to protect the truth by protecting those who risk everything to tell it. Jasmine didn't want symbolism. She wanted structure, something real, something permanent. She had seen firsthand what happened when brave people tried to do the right thing in the wrong system. They were isolated, investigated, erased. That was the cost of integrity and silence. She was done watching it happen. The SHIELD project began with 3 staff members: a cybersecurity advisor who'd once been a target herself, a legal investigator who walked away from a 6-figure job because he couldn't sleep at night, and Jasmine, serving as executive director, unpaid, full-time. Its mission was razor-focused: free legal defense for whistleblowers, anonymous reporting frameworks, and immediate digital protection for anyone attempting to speak out from within government, defense, or intelligence agencies. No red tape, no waiting lists. Just one question: what do you need to stay safe long enough to be heard? Within 48 hours of going live, the inbox flooded. Some messages were vague, others urgent. A few included names Jasmine recognized from sealed files she was never supposed to have seen. She read every word, every cry for help, every line of fear written by people who'd seen too much and been silenced too often. Jasmine didn't just empathize, she remembered the weight, the loneliness, the risk of becoming a story before you could even finish telling your truth. But there were 2 names that never left her mind, 2 voices that had once tried to reach the system the right way, only to be buried beneath it. 2 people whose careers, reputations, and lives had been nearly destroyed so others could avoid embarrassment. The whistleblowers, the ones at the center of the surveillance case, the ones she'd defended without ever meeting face to face. Until now. She made no announcement when she decided to visit them. No reporters followed her to the modest private location where they now lived under protection orders. Jasmine didn't arrive in a suit. She wore a hoodie and jeans. She didn't come with cameras. She came with legal papers and her name signed at the bottom of every one. Protection, pro bono representation, medical assistance, and, above all else, recognition. The first witness, let's call her Leah, had been a systems analyst for a federal data retention project. She'd discovered metadata collection directives far outside legal boundaries. When she raised the issue, her clearance was suspended, her office searched, and her career ended in a whisper. For 2 years, she lived in limbo. No job, no restitution, no peace. She opened the door cautiously when Jasmine knocked. For a few seconds, she didn't say anything, just stared. Jasmine introduced herself, but she didn't need to. Leah already knew. "You're the reason they're calling me back," she said, her voice shaking. I didn't think I'd ever even be believed again." Jasmine nodded once, slowly. "I didn't just believe you," she said. "I used your truth to tear the roof off." They didn't hug. Not at first. It was too raw, too wide. But Leah stepped back and let Jasmine in. Not just into her house, but into the small, broken world she'd been living in since the system turned its back. The second whistleblower, Marcus, was a quiet man with tired eyes and a nervous gait. He'd worked inside a legal review unit for counter-surveillance protocols. He wasn't a leaker, he was a witness, and when he spoke up, internal memos labeled him hostile to operational continuity. They threatened prosecution. His home was raided, his children questioned. No charges were filed. But that wasn't the point. They didn't need to convict him, they just needed to silence him. When Jasmine met him at a safe location, far from the city, far from the headlines, he was hesitant to speak. Even now, even with proof of vindication. But when she handed him the signed exoneration letter, notarized and certified, he just stared at it, like it couldn't be real. Then he looked up, and there were tears in his eyes, but he didn't cry out of relief. He cried from something deeper: recognition, justice, grief that had finally found its voice. "I didn't think I'd live to see this day," he said quietly, "but you didn't just save me. You saved the system. You gave it a chance to mean something again. Jasmine didn't speak for a while. She didn't need to, because she knew what he meant. This wasn't about glory. It wasn't about clearing names. It was about proving the system could be watched. That power could be confronted without being destroyed, and truth could still be louder than fear if someone just held the line long enough. The SHIELD project expanded slowly but steadily. Jasmine refused corporate donations. She refused anything that even smelled like compromise. The funding came from individual contributions, small grants, and legal reinvestments from wrongful termination cases they won on behalf of silenced employees. And when they did, within the first 6 months, they'd prevented 3 retaliatory investigations, stopped 2 internal gag orders, and successfully reopened a case that had been resolved behind closed doors. But for Jasmine, it wasn't about the wins. It was about the walls not closing in on people trying to do the right thing. It was about building a shelter in a world that had once taught her truth was something to survive, not speak. She never forgot what she was up against. She never pretended the fight was over. But as she walked back to her small legal office after every SHIELD project consult, after every call with a terrified federal contractor or silenced analyst, she carried something new in her steps. Not weight, not fear, conviction. Because now, for the first time in a very long time, the system knew it was being watched back. And it wasn't being watched by journalists or politicians. It was being watched by someone who had stood before it, called it what it was, and walked away not to escape it, but to build a lifeline for the next person brave enough to speak. That's what Jasmine Crockett had become. Not a hero, not a rebel, not a symbol, but a shield. And sometimes that's the most powerful thing truth can ask for. But the work Jasmine Crockett started in a single courtroom didn't end there. Because when truth survives the fire, it leaves behind something even stronger, a law, 12 months to the day. That's how long it took to turn a moment into a mandate. In a packed congressional chamber under tight security and relentless public scrutiny, the final vote was called on what had become the most anticipated piece of legislation in a generation. The Transparency and Citizen Protection Act, a bill born not from committee meetings or backroom deals, but from the ashes of a trial that had put power on the defensive and made the country watch itself in real time. Cameras lined the balcony. Protesters gathered outside in freezing rain, holding signs with phrases that had once echoed through a courtroom. Truth doesn't need to shout. Justice can't live in the dark. We are the watchdogs now. The public didn't just want a law. They wanted a reckoning in writing, a protection that couldn't be redacted, a guardrail that didn't depend on who sat behind the bench. Inside the chamber, lawmakers sat stiffly, aware that every movement, every gesture, was being broadcast live to a country still skeptical. The weeks leading up to the vote had been brutal. Lobbyists had tried to water it down. Agencies pushed back on language. Some called it dangerous, idealistic, a threat to operational security. But every time an amendment came forward designed to weaken the bill, someone, usually a younger member, would rise and say just 4 words. Remember what she proved. And that stopped the arguments cold. Because Jasmine Crockett had already done what the law was now trying to ensure. She held the system accountable and walked away with the receipts still smoking in her hands. She'd shown what happened when whistleblowers were abandoned. She'd exposed the high cost of silence, and she'd survived the full weight of a machine that had tried to crush her, not for lying, but for telling the truth at the wrong time to the wrong people. The bill was sweeping. It required mandatory third-party review of classified whistleblower claims within 30 days. It created a federal digital shield program to prevent surveillance data from being used to retaliate against those who exposed abuse. It restricted the ability of federal judges to seal oversight documents unless national security risk could be proven, not speculated. It gave whistleblowers the right to directly petition Congress when suppressed by internal channels. And it made any willful delay of such testimony a federal offense. It was unprecedented. And it was Jasmine Crockett in legislative form. The speaker called for order. The roll call began. One by one, the chamber filled with ayes and nays. But the outcome had been written long before the numbers landed. Every eye in the room, Every viewer watching at home knew the bill wasn't just passing. It was being carved into history. When the final tally was read, the room didn't erupt into cheers. There was no applause, just a collective breath held, then exhaled. Because this wasn't celebration, it was relief and a silent promise. Never again. Outside the Capitol, the rain hadn't stopped. A small group huddled under umbrellas held up a cardboard sign with Jasmine's name on it. Not glamorized, not gilded, just handwritten, bold, and underlined. A woman in her 60s stood beneath it and whispered to no one in particular, "She changed everything." Jasmine wasn't there. She wasn't in the gallery. She hadn't issued a statement. She hadn't tweeted. She had nothing to say, because the bill spoke for her. It had already said enough. Instead, she was in a cramped community office 3 states away, finishing a legal intake interview for a housing case. She didn't flinch when her assistant slid a note under her door that read, "The bill passed. It's law." She read it once, nodded, then turned back to her client and said, "Let's fix this lease." Because Jasmine Crockett didn't need a podium to make history. She just needed a table, a chair, and a reason. And a year after the system tried to silence her, that same system had been rewritten in her echo. But even after the law had passed and the headlines faded, Jasmine Crockett's story kept moving, in small rooms and quiet conversations, and once unexpectedly, in the back row of a law school classroom. It was a late fall afternoon, the kind of day where the sky looked tired and the trees held on to the last of their color. Inside the law school lecture hall, the students were restless, fidgeting with coffee cups, typing half-hearted notes on cases they barely believed in. Most had no idea who the guest speaker was until she walked in. Jasmine Crockett entered without announcement. No security, no title card, just her name on the day's syllabus and a simple black notebook in her hand. The room didn't go silent because they recognized her. It went silent because they felt her, like the energy had shifted, like something real had just entered a space that too often dealt in theory. She didn't stand behind the podium. She didn't turn on a slideshow. She walked to the center of the room, set the notebook on the desk, and looked every student in the eye before speaking. "I'm not here to talk about the law in books," she said. "I'm here to talk about the law in rooms where it hides." And just like that, they listened. For the next hour, Jasmine didn't quote cases. She didn't cite precedent. She told a story, her story, not with grandeur or dramatics, but with the steady clarity of someone who had lived through something most people never even dare to imagine. Standing alone in a courtroom where the truth was the loudest thing in the room, and still not enough until you made it be. She spoke of sealed memos and unsigned threats, of whistleblowers left dangling while the system closed ranks, of walking into a federal hearing with no backup, knowing the judge in front of her had already made up her mind and doing it anyway. She spoke not like someone trying to impress, but like someone trying to prepare them. Because Jasmine knew what most professors couldn't teach, that justice isn't something you memorize, it's something you risk for. The room hung on every word. Even the students who usually sat in the back row, texting, were now still, eyes fixed. One of them, young, wide-eyed, not more than 22, finally raised their hand near the end. They didn't sound challenging. They sounded honest. "Weren't you scared?" the student asked. "Facing down a system like that? Weren't you afraid?" Jasmine paused, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted them to hear it right. Then she smiled, not wide, not performative, but with a weight that said, "I've been there, and I still carry it." "Of course I was scared," she said. "Only fools aren't." The class leaned in. "But fear isn't the enemy of justice," she continued. "Compromise is. Silence is. That slow, polite shrug we give when the truth makes people in power uncomfortable, that's what kills justice, not fear. Fear just tells you the fight matters." No one spoke after that, not because they were stunned, but because they knew, instinctively, that what she had just said wasn't theory. It was reality, the kind they were all going to face someday, in courtrooms and boardrooms, maybe even in their own consciences. Jasmine didn't promise them it would be easy. She didn't promise it would be fair. She just made it clear. The system doesn't break unless someone pushes, and someone always has to be the first to push. She closed her notebook, thanked them for their time, and walked out as quietly as she had entered. But no one forgot her, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to lecture. She'd come to light a fuse. As the classroom doors closed behind her and her footsteps echoed down the empty hallway, Jasmine Crockett didn't feel triumph. She felt memory, the kind that never lets you forget why you stood up in the first place. She remembered what it felt like to walk into that hearing room for the first time, not as a star witness, not as a symbol, but as a target. The emails had warned her. The messages had told her not to go through with it. They tried to remind her of everything she had to lose, her license, her safety, her future, and yet she walked in anyway, alone, with a plain gray suit and a box full of truths nobody wanted on the record. She wasn't powerful. She wasn't protected. She didn't even have a guarantee that she'd be allowed to finish her testimony. But none of that mattered, because there are moments when the cost of silence is higher than the cost of speaking. And Jasmine had hit hers long before the hearing was ever scheduled. What most people never saw were the nights before that moment. The way she sat on the floor with documents spread around her like landmines, knowing each one could blow her life wide open. The weight of knowing that no one was coming to rescue her if things went wrong. The way her hands trembled not from fear of lies, but from the enormity of telling the truth when the entire room was built to deny it. And still, she rose. She rose when logic told her to keep her head down. She rose when former allies distanced themselves. She rose when whispers warned her, "You don't win against the machine." She never stood because she believed she could win. She stood because she believed it had to be done, even if she lost. That's what justice demands. It doesn't call for the most powerful person in the room. It calls for the only one willing to rise while everyone else stays bowed. She had no seat at the head of the table, no title that guaranteed respect, no institution vouching for her intentions. What she had was paper, evidence, and a voice too steady to be dismissed as emotional. And when she spoke, when she said, "You wanted a source?" Her name is on this memo. The entire foundation shifted. Not because she shouted, not because she performed, but because she stood, exactly when the system expected her to kneel. The memory didn't fade, not after the law passed, not after the judge was suspended, not even after reporters stopped asking for interviews. That hearing room was still with her. The pressure, the eyes, the silence, the risk. That's why her answer in the classroom was real. Yes, I was afraid. Because only someone who's been there can say that out loud and still keep their voice from breaking. But fear isn't what stopped others. Fear can be felt and still walk through. What stopped them, what keeps systems broken, is comfort, is the shrug, is the compromise dressed in procedure, is the belief that someone else will eventually do what's right. But Jasmine Crockett never waited for someone else. She stood, and in doing so, she reminded an entire nation what justice actually looks like. Not robes, not gavels, not chambers full of rituals, but a single person choosing not to bow when everyone else is still pretending they don't see the fire. Justice didn't come from the top of the institution. It didn't come from powerful donors or carefully worded statements. It didn't even come from the law. Not at first. It came from one woman standing upright with shaking hands and a steel voice, knowing full well that speaking up would change her life, and not necessarily for the better. Because justice isn't safe. It never was. It's not comfort wrapped in compromise. It's confrontation wrapped in clarity. And Jasmine Crockett gave it everything she had, not for applause, not for legacy, but for the people who would never make it into that hearing room. The whistleblowers that erased, the ones who tried to do the right thing and were punished for it. She carried their voices in that box. And when she set those documents down on the table, she did it with the weight of 100 stories that no one else was willing to tell. Now the law bears her fingerprints. Now the classroom carries her echo. And now every student in that room, every future attorney who sat in stunned silence after hearing her say, "Fear isn't the enemy, compromise is," walks into the future with one truth etched in their bones. Justice doesn't come from the most powerful people. It comes from the one who stands when everyone else stays bowed. And sometimes all it takes is one person willing to do just that. Once, loudly enough, so that the next time, someone else knows how. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.